Okay. Okay. Thank you all for coming. We're going to get started. My name is Yael Schaffer. I'm a senior U.S. advocate here at Refugees International. Voices from the Border is a series of events we're having here to inform and humanize policy discussions in Washington about border policies. The goal is to hear from advocates and affected individuals about what is really happening at the border, the impact of current policies, and what needs to be done to make changes for the better. This is the second public event in our Voices from the Border series. The first one was on the Remain in Mexico program, and future ones will be on other policies at the border, such as the asylum cooperative agreements we have signed with Central American governments. At the last event, which was on the Remain in Mexico policy, we invited guests from the San Diego, Tijuana, and El Paso, Juarez areas of the border. And this time we have Olivia Pena, who is here from the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights in Harlingen, in the Rio Grande Valley, where the majority of unaccompanied minors entered the country last year, and a lot of people are coming in that way. Future events will focus on other areas of the border, explicitly, especially Arizona and Sonora, which we haven't looked at yet. I met Olivia when I visited the Harlingen, Brownsville, Matamoros area to investigate the way Remain in Mexico policy was working. In Matamoros, I was appalled by the way the policy was stranding families on the Mexican side of the border. And what bothered me most was the lack of security and education for kids and the idea that some would cross into the U.S. alone out of desperation. I also witnessed a devastating scene in a Harlingen immigration courtroom. It was an encounter of a Guatemalan woman about my age and her son, let's call him John, who was in his early 20s. John had come to the U.S. as an unaccompanied minor a decade ago, fleeing poverty and violence fueled by Mexican drug cartels and government ineffectiveness in Ixtaquan, San Marcos, Guatemala. And he had won asylum in the United States almost a decade ago. About 8 years ago, he won asylum. Now his mother was seeking the same protection, and yet new asylum policies at the border made it very hard for them to unite with one another. The scene was devastating, too, because this was the first time mother and son had seen each other in a decade, and they only got to do so through a television screen because of the way the immigration court system is now functioning at the border, with people stuck in Matamoros and going to these 10 courts where they see a judge through a television screen, basically. Both mother and son were crying. John understood his mother, but answered her in a combination of Mom, Spanish, and English. He's been here a while. I tell you these stories to make clear that family separation is happening at the border in very complicated ways, but also to make clear that we've had in this country a protection system for unaccompanied minors, a protection system that helped John when he came here a decade ago, who crossed the border as a teenager, was held only briefly in Border Patrol custody, and then was sent to a center for children in Texas run by Southwest Keys for a few months, and helped with his case in immigration court. And then he was adopted by a family in Boston, where he went to high school and college, and now has a masonry and paving company business in Boston. The system was far from perfect back then. There are problems, of course, then, but now even the protections that existed then are under threat. In October 2017, President Trump issued his border priorities. The first one was a border wall. The second one had to do with unaccompanied alien children, which is a new way of referring to these children, I think, or more prevalent now, which talks about all the reforms and all the protections that exist for children that he wants to basically get rid of, including the TVPRA, which protects especially children from Central America from fast deportation home, the Flores Settlement Agreement, which protects or maintains certain detention standards and limits on how long children can be detained, and amends the term special immigrant for special immigrant juvenile status visas that many children are eligible for. So these are some of the major protections that are under threat right now, and that There's nobody better equipped to explain the system and some of the protections that are under threat than Jen Putticle from KIND, who I'll pass the mic to first. Jennifer will also speak about how KIND thinks we can push back and ensure protection for unaccompanied minors. After Jennifer's presentation, I'll ask Olivia a few questions about her work at the border and the impact of policies there. Last but not least, the panelist to introduce is Jocelyn, who will speak about her experience coming to the United States as an unaccompanied minor and how she's doing now. One last thing before I pass the mic. Policy towards unaccompanied minors is not just a border issue, but extends all across the country. After unaccompanied minors enter at the border, they're usually transferred to shelters or influx facilities now all across the country. In Florida, people know of the kind of an infamous influx facility, and then they're placed with sponsors in communities across the country. Jocelyn, our third speaker, will speak about being here in this area where we are. Also, like Jocelyn and John, the person I spoke about earlier, the vast majority of unaccompanied minors enter this country as teenagers, over the age of 15. This makes sense, since children of this age in Central America are at such heightened risk of violence, which is some of the reasons they're leaving, which we'll hear about on this panel. But recent policies have also made them particularly vulnerable as soon as they turn 18 or age out of protections. After Jocelyn speaks, I'll speak a little bit more about this, especially how new policies have particularly impacted young people between the ages of 18 and 21 through arrest and detention policies and attempts to put limits on who can qualify for those special immigrant juvenile status visas that I mentioned before. So I'll end there, and I'll pass the mic to Jen.
Thanks so much. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm Jen. I work at Kids in Need of Defense. We are an organization that provides attorneys to unaccompanied kids as they make their way through the immigration court process. I'm here in DC on KIND's policy team, so I'm going to kind of give the boring, technical, legal background of this to frame the conversation that we're going to have. Let me just start off with who is an unaccompanied child, right? So it's a child who is apprehended by immigration enforcement, and they're under the age of 18, and they're not in the care of a parent or a legal guardian in that moment of apprehension, right? So the parent could be in Mexico, the parent could be in Chicago, but they're not with that parent during the time of apprehension. Now that's really important because the whole legal framework around how kids go through the system is based on the fact that immediately upon apprehension, whether that's at the border, whether that's in the interior, things start moving and start happening that have big implications for the kid's legal case. And so when a child is alone and they're not with a parent or a legal guardian who can speak for them, it's important that those protections attach in that moment because that child's case will proceed a little bit differently because Congress recognized the unique vulnerabilities of a child who's on their own. Now, this is also important because what we're seeing is when people are leaving wherever it is in the world, their home country, oftentimes kids might be traveling with an extended family member, right? The importance of these children, even if they are with an uncle or with a grandparent, it's important, again, for them to be designated as unaccompanied because that extended family member's, their case, is not going to automatically be attached to the child's case. The child, again, is still on their own. They're going to have to make their defense to deportation and ask for humanitarian protection all on their own, even if they're with an extended family member. So it's a very important legal distinction. This idea of unaccompanied kids, right, children who are traveling on their own, it's certainly not new, right? This has been happening forever, all over the world. What's new is the singular kind of laser focus this population has garnered from the current administration and has really used it as a way to show that they're exercising or flexing enforcement muscles against asylum seekers. You know, this population, I think their visibility has really been lifted because there has been a laser focus on looking really harsh or increasing enforcement against this population. we saw it, as Eyal mentioned, we saw this, day one of this administration when they issued executive orders that outlined, a very specific, very detailed outline on all the ways that they wanted to roll back protections for this uniquely vulnerable population. I think even to this day, those of us who are working in it are still shocked every time we see another attack on this population, not because it wasn't outlined already for us very clearly, but it's still so shocking that this is the population that the administration has really tried to focus on harming and limiting protections for. The two big pieces of legislation that outline the protections for these kids include the 2008 reauthorization of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. Now, what that did is recognize the unique vulnerabilities to trafficking and exploitation that this population faces, children on their own who aren't with adults who can protect them and speak for them, or whose case they'll be included in. So what Congress did is they outlined specific protections, not saying all these kids can come here and stay, but what they said is, let's do some common sense modifications about how these kids' cases go through the system to make sure they have a fair opportunity to tell their story, and so that we as a government can make a better decision about which kids could safely be returned and repatriated and which kids need humanitarian protection here in the United States. The other big protection for children, which I think has been getting a lot of attention as of late, is the Flores legal settlement. Just to give a 2-second recap on what that was, is over 20 years ago, there was a lawsuit saying the way the federal government was holding children and immigrant children was deplorable. You go back and you read some of the underlying facts of the first case, and it's pretty horrific. And so the government was sued. It went up to the Supreme Court. They ended up in a legal settlement where the government said, okay, fine, we'll agree to these minimum standards when the government holds children, like giving them water, letting them have a shower. We'll agree to it. We'll abide by the settlement. We'll be under the watchful eye of the federal court with this legal settlement just until we promulgate regulations where we outline what these minimum standards are going to be, and that the minimum standards had to meet what the legal settlement was. Now, the Flores settlement has been in effect because the government has never bothered to promulgate and issue final regulations until recently. And this administration put forward new regulations that really lowered the standard of what the government's responsibility would be anytime they were holding a child. Again, shocking. And so right now, this issue is being litigated to decide, is the federal court going to say, okay, the government met what the minimum standards were in the settlement, or is there a big difference and the court should maintain jurisdiction over this issue? Now, when I'm talking about detention of kids, there's a couple different ways in which the government is holding kids, right? So we're talking about a child who may approach the border, right? It could be between a port of entry. It could be that they walk across a bridge and they present themselves to an official. In that moment, they will be detained by Customs and Border Protection. Now, those are those little tiny cells and cages that you've probably seen pictures of in the media, where kids are supposed to be held no longer than 72 hours because the conditions are just really inappropriate for children, probably inappropriate for adults, but specifically inappropriate for children. During that time, a CBP official will screen the child, and if they determine that child is unaccompanied, they meet that legal definition, they will be referred to Health and Human Services. Now, there's a arm of Health and Human Services called the Office of Refugee Resettlement that's responsible for the care and custody of children. Now, the reason, Congress did this when the Homeland Security Act was created to separate enforcement, right, immigration enforcement, which is the responsibility of Homeland Security, from the care and custody of kids, and gave the responsibility of care and custody to an agency, to Health and Human Services, that has expertise in child welfare and the more experience implementing this concept of the best interest of the child. Now, immediately when CBP has a child in their custody, right, that's the moment the deportation proceedings start, right? Right away, the official documents are filed, questions are asked of the child, and the ball gets rolling for the court case, right? So as the child works their way through the system, they're physically in a Border Patrol facility, then they're going to go to a shelter for children that's run by ORR. When ORR gets the kid, they right away start looking for someone in the United States who's willing to care for that child at no cost to the government, right? And who's willing to have that child in their home and agree to take that child and support that child through their immigration court case. Because the immigration court cases take a long time, it's important kids get out of custody and they're able to live in a home with someone who can care for them while they're going through the court process. So you have kids who need information about what's happening to their case while they're in custody, and then also after they leave custody because their case is still going on. Again, talking about these policy changes that have really limited kids' ability to go through the system fairly and ask for protection, right? They've been very visible. Nobody's trying to hide anything, right? Everyone remember family separation, right? I mean, these policies that we all, I think, across the board, regardless of, your political persuasion or how you feel about immigration, feel absurd and terrible and horrific, right? And these are really intended, I think, to show that there's some sort of, commitment to enforcement, but really causing, incredible harm to kids who have already experienced really terrible things, which is why they're coming here in the first place. KIND has been documenting, we have a timeline on our website where we have been tracking all the administrative changes, right? There have been changes Homeland Security has done, Health and Human Services has done, the Department of Justice has done that have really limited kids' ability to go through the system safely. We called it, death by 1,000 cuts, because you read one policy and you think, well, that's bad, but that's not the end of it. And then you read the next one and you think, and these policies are all squeezing the way kids' cases can just be made through the system, just so kids can have a fair opportunity to tell their story. And Olivia's going to talk about how a lot of the border changes and all the policies affecting the border, even some of them don't technically apply to unaccompanied kids, how they're harming children, and how they actually are impeding kids' ability to get protection in the United States. Okay, lots of bad news. So what's the good news, right? The litigation has been a big game right now in pushing back against a lot of these changes. Some of them are clearly unlawful, right? And so we're relying on the courts to say to the administration, you've gone too far, and you need to stop with some of these policies. There's been some great successes and some pending, hopefully successes that we're going to see soon that have really, enhanced kids' ability to continue to move forward with their cases. I will say Congress, has really stepped forward in terms of oversight. There's not a lot of legislation that's moving and getting signed these days, but for the appropriations process. And I think appropriators are taking very seriously their responsibility and really trying to be creative in how they can use the power of the purse to conduct oversight and limit bad policies against kids. So there have been significant wins through the appropriations process that we've been pleased, in Congress's response to this. I think for KIND, we work a lot with the private sector. So private attorneys who work with firms and corporations who are coming forward, stepping forward and taking these kids' cases for free, doing it pro bono. It's been really heartening to see the private sector really step forward and be supportive of these kids in our systems. And then, I don't have to say this because she's going to show it to you all, but, the kids themselves, I keep joking, I'm going to be working for one of our clients one of these days. I mean, what these kids are doing when they have a chance and they get protection and they are safe and they're settled, it's really amazing, but I'll stop there because I'll let Yesenia tell us.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to mention sort of, before I start asking Olivia specific questions, some like two of the specific, cuts policies that have really influenced people, unaccompanied minors coming in. One is sort of like a speeded up court process where before legal advocates can take the cases of children, they're sort of being rushed through the system so they don't really understand what's going on in court with their cases and deported quickly. So that's that's a problem. Any kind of speed up like that is a problem because when unaccompanied minors go through the system, part of the protections is that it's not supposed to be an adversarial process. It's supposed to be a slow process where children understand what's going on with them in court. Another major problem has to do with information sharing between the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the Department of Homeland Security. That is making that divide between enforcement and protection much more blurry and leading to prolonged detention of children because sponsors are afraid to come forward because they're afraid they'll be arrested, or information that children give to the Office of Refugee Resettlement in private, talking about violence that they've experienced in their home country, is then used against them in court by the Department of Homeland Security when they're actually asking for asylum. So that enforcement protection divide is becoming blurrier, and that's a problem for many, many unaccompanied kids. Okay, now I'll turn to Olivia. Thank you so much, Jen. That was very, very clear explanation of a system that's actually quite complicated and, as you heard, divided between different agencies of the government and hard to understand. Okay, so I'm going to ask Olivia a couple of questions. I'll start with this first one. So I know you provide numerous services and interact with all these different agencies that were just discussed to advocate on behalf of unaccompanied children. Can you discuss some of these efforts, providing a few examples of the kind of casework that you do?
Sure. And I think I'll just start with giving a little bit of background on the Young Center first. The Young Center is a nonprofit organization that provides independent child advocates to the unaccompanied and separated immigrant children at these detention facilities. And we initially started back in 2004, so about 16 years ago. But in 2008, the TVPRA specifically said that HHS can appoint these independent child advocates to these children. And so since then, you know, our main goal at the Young Center is to promote the safety and well-being of these unaccompanied and separated children through different types of advocacy with all of these agencies. And so we use a paradigm that is not made up. It is based on the laws of all the states that really focuses on what the child wants, what is safe for that child, liberty, family unity, identity, development, all those things that at some point once they arrive to these facilities, they are sort of like forgotten about, because I'm not sure if all of you know this, but there isn't a best interest standard in immigration law. A lot of the states have a best interest standard in their state law, and they have special courts, special dockets, special rules, and every child gets an attorney. But in the immigration system, we don't have that for children. And so we are sort of like pushing through and making sure that all of these agencies are recognizing those best interests and making sure that they treat the children first as children before just, it's not just another person that you're going to go through. And so we make recommendations to all of these agencies that make decisions as to what should happen to these children. And so we can make recommendations to HHS and ORR about whether they should release a child or not to their potential sponsors. We talk about, also make recommendations regarding transfers. So a lot of the children who are in these facilities have a lot of trauma that hasn't been, processed, and so they are going through a lot of issues, and so they have a lot of mental health needs. But oftentimes those needs are sort of, not looked at from the perspective of, a trauma-focused approach, and so they tend to want to step them up or, send them to more restrictive settings. And so we advocate for children not be placed in more restrictive settings, and instead be given the opportunity to process their trauma through outside support services. Maybe more actual psychologists and social workers who can, work through and help them process this trauma. And I'm going to give you a very quick example of the type of advocacy. So we were working with a teenage girl from Central America who was running away from gang violence, and she made it all the way across. And once she was on U.S. soil, she was sexually assaulted by her guide. She knew, and she kept telling everyone, I was raped. The Border Patrol officers took me to the hospital. But, HHS kept asking Border Patrol, give us those records, and they weren't providing those records. So we got on the case. We went through all of the hospitals in the RGV area and eventually secured the records, because those records would then help her file for a U visa. So we helped obtain the U visa certification. We advocated for legal representation. She eventually got her U visa certification. She was able to transfer to a long-term foster care placement, and she, got the status as a result of all that she had gone through. And now she's in a place where she's getting the support services that she needs, because while she was also in these shelters, there was a lot of misconceptions about her behavior, and so we had to contextualize, this is all a result of her trauma. This is not, a child who's going, just trying to be rebellious. She's really dealing with a lot, and we were trying to get her to a more permanent placement with more support services. And that's sort of like the advocacy that we do with like HHS. We also do advocacy with ICE in terms of those age-out children. A lot of the times these children sometimes they don't have people here, so we secure post-18 placements. We try to get them connected with services and do the advocacy with ICE to let them go and not transfer them to adult detention, because they go from one day being in a shelter that's tailored for children then to an adult jail-like setting. It's not ideal, and they don't have the services that they need. That's just an example of how we work with the different agencies.
Thanks. I just wanted to clarify for those of you who aren't as knowledgeable as all of these folks. So the ORR, the Office of Refugee, has different types of, they put children in different types of facilities, some of which are more restrictive than others, depending on the background of the child. So This is why advocacy is so important. I mean, you could basically be put in essentially a jail for children if you have a criminal record, or if there's some sign of that, or that you're at risk of absconding, different reasons. And this is why advocacy is so important, to make sure that children are placed in the least restrictive setting, as Olivia was pointing out. And a U visa is a special visa for people who are victims of crimes. And that's why documenting something like a rape is so important. Okay, the other question I just wanted to ask, or I have two other questions. So, okay, there have been a lot of policy changes over the last 2 years, or 3 years, that influenced your work, which we've heard about a little bit. I know that you've done presentations in Matamoros for those subjected to remain in Mexico, what I was talking about before, but I'm sure there's some other policy changes that have influenced your work that I absolutely do not know about. So please, is there some that you could speak about?
I don't think it's something that you don't know about, but we all heard about the zero tolerance policy and the parent-child separation. At our office, we, since we're based on the border, and that's where the highest number of children come in, and currently right now there's almost 5,000 placements for children there. We see like the effect of all of these policies, like from the beginning. We're at the front lines of all of this. And so one of the things that when we started seeing the parent-child separation cases, we started seeing a lot of very tender age children struggling with the trauma of being separated. A lot of them crying, just recounting the story. A lot of them are saying, well, my parent is in jail. A lot of resentment towards those parents for not coming back and picking them up. And so there was a lot of, we had to start getting very creative with all of these agencies to making sure that first these children had access to their parents, had communication with these parents, and then ensure that there was a reunification of these children with these parents. And so that sort of like shifted our advocacy to sort of like, doing a lot of those cases. Now we have, thankfully, a staff member that just solely focuses on parent-child separation cases, because the impact that it has on the children, it's not just, something that lasts while they're here. It actually impacts their life long term, even after they're reunited with these parents, because now the parents have to deal with the child's, lack of, affection, because they were separated for sometimes really long periods of time. Another one that, you touched on briefly is the limitations on the Flores settlement. We're always making sure that children, or advocating for children to get released and be placed in the least restrictive setting. And so we're concerned, the more limitations they put on this, the less protections that children will receive. And then, of course, the changes in asylum law. It's getting harder and harder for children to really get relief under asylum law, and it's really concerning to see how they all have really good legitimate claims based on gang violence, on domestic violence, and now all of these policies that have been put in place really just prevent them from getting that sort of protection. And we all know asylum is a right, and they should be able to get it, but it's based on these policies that they won't be able to.
Thank you. And there was actually, I think, litigation going on right now about one of these asylum restrictions that makes it basically people unable to apply for asylum if their family members have been persecuted. So this makes children extremely vulnerable. So even if a father might win asylum, or based on something, if the child comes later, or given other restrictions on asylum, sometimes people are not eligible for asylum, but they're only eligible for like more limited forms of relief that don't have derivatives. So you can't if a parent wins this form of relief, they can't kind of also win it for their children. So by doing that, it's also affecting a lot of kids. Kids are sort of like aren't getting the same relief that their parents are getting, even if they have claims that are similar. So it's the limits on asylum are just sort of unbelievable how many there are, and affecting so many children. So not to end on that bad note, but so what are, I guess there are two questions I wanted to ask you. First, I know one of the things that I was fascinated to hear that the Young Center, and this is might be a little surprise, that the Young Center does is also sort of do determinations in home countries about whether or not it's possible to repatriate children. I mean, the Young Center doesn't just do work at the border, which is kind of an amazing thing. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, if you can. And then the other thing I wanted you to speak about is just some of the ways that you think, if we were going to move in a more positive direction, what we could do, and what should policymakers in Washington sort of keep at the forefront of their minds when thinking about the needs and rights of unaccompanied children where you work.
For sure. So yes, at the Young Center, we have this multidisciplinary approach of attorneys and social workers working together to make sure that we have a very holistic, view and approach to the recommendations that we're making on behalf of these children. And the cases that we work with, they're the most complex cases. So we are assigned to the most vulnerable, within the already vulnerable population of children in these shelters. And so oftentimes we are faced with situations where the paradigm, although it has been established by multiple states and by international law, by the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, it doesn't necessarily make it clear-cut as to how we should recommend, what recommendation we should make. And so sometimes what we have to do is we have to do international home studies, and especially in the situations of children who are very young, and who there may be some concern with, a safety concern with them returning to their countries of origin. We do connect with organizations on the ground in the different countries to conduct these international home studies, visit the home, speak to the parents, speak to the neighbors, go to the schools, and kind of just get a really good assessment of what's going on back home before we make this recommendation to the judge that they should be returned. And one of the very good examples that I have is we worked with a group of a 3 and a 5-year-old sisters, and they were in care for more than 300 days. They were separated from their mother at the border, and while they were there, they were always saying, we want to go with our mom, we want to go with our mom. But the way that the system is made, every time they went to court, they would always get automatically reset because they're under the age of 14. And so unless the children had an attorney or a child advocate, they would have never been able to verbalize and say, I want to be with my mom. So once we got on the case, we did an international home study. They visited the home. They confirmed that there was no safety concerns with them going back. We went before the court, and even though there was still some hesitation from the attorneys to represent them, because 3 and 5-year-olds will not tell you, I want to go back to Guatemala. I want to go back to Honduras. They just say, I want to be with my mom, and can my mom come here? And the thing is, that's not possible. So then it's our role to let everyone else know that even though they can't expressly state what they want, they still tell us through drawings, through play, that they want to go with the caregiver, their mother. And so we advocated with the court to make sure that they sent them back, in a safe manner, connected them with services on the ground. I know we work closely with KIND and other organizations to make sure that upon return, they are connected with support services. So we also do what we call the best interest determinations panels, and in situations where we don't have, the expertise and the knowledge, we gather experts to kind of come in and say, this is what should be the recommendation. And we're talking about country conditions experts, psychologists, different types of experts that can, really help us make an informed decision. And so one of the things that I want to end up in terms of like what can other people do is, you really need to adopt the best interest standard. There really has to be something in the law that says that any person who makes a decision should really be considering these children's best interest. And we're talking about the most basic in terms of what they want in safety, but also like all the other things that I mentioned earlier, like identity, family unity, liberty, and development. So adopt the best interest standard. Make sure that all judges, all federal agents, all agencies have that best interest standard in mind. And then also provide more protections for kids. Just like in state courts, every child should have an attorney. Everyone should have someone by their side to be able to advocate for what they want and for what's best for them, as well as in our area, particularly at least in the Rio Grande Valley, which is the border with Mexico, and that has like the most port of entries. Although our area is it's amazing, it's wonderful. We have a great community of advocates that we get together. It's really lacking in resources. So increasing mental health support, increasing resources as to long-term care placements for these children. If there's a way that they could focus on making sure that the RGV has more resources, because if we're going to keep receiving the highest amount of children, we should be able to have the resources to be able to take care of them.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And I learned from Jennifer Nagda, who also works at the Young Center, about how few federal placements there are for children. So in the federal foster care system, there's really not very many placements, and the need is huge. And some of what has changed is, the best interest standard. The only, like the special immigrant juvenile status visas has a sort of best interest standard in there a little bit. But beyond that, as was said before, the immigration system, immigration law didn't really take children in mind. And so you have to carve out these protections for children in the TVPRA and elsewhere. And it's finding that place for children in the immigration system, as Olivia has pointed out, is really, I think, a task that people have been doing for, since 2002, when there were special laws about this, or even longer through the Flores settlement litigation, which started in the 1980s. And so this has been going on for 40 years, the litigation on behalf of unaccompanied minors, and it really needs to continue. And yet still we have a ways to go in making sure that this best interest standard, especially now, is made part of the system. Okay, and with that, we'll turn our attention to Yaslin, who will talk a little bit about her experience coming in as an unaccompanied minor and since then.
Thank you. My name is Jocelyn, and I am 20 years old. I'm originally from Guatemala, and then I left my country when I was 16 years old. I left my country running from violence, and after a few months, I was able to renew it with a family member in DC. Kind has helped me in many different ways. They helped me with school. They have helped me to make my dreams true. When I met Kind Adorne for the first time, I couldn't believe that they told me that they're gonna assist me with a pro bono help. And I feel so lucky to have that opportunity. There's many children out there, they don't have that support. And I feel so important, or I feel honored in that way. When we went to court, I never feel alone. Usually there were sometimes two Adorne that were there, because I was starting to learn English, and then so one Adorne helped me to translate, and the other one just as represent as Adorne. So that feels really good, feeling that you have people that support you. Without Kind, I wouldn't be continuing with my school. Now I am in college. I finished high school last year, and I'm the first person in my family to obtain a high school. And when when I grew up, I never thought I would be able to come to this country and the possibility to study to this country. I never thought that. So I usually thought that I'll go to the United States, I'll work, and do something in Guatemala. Like that's usually the goal that usually tell your parents told you, like go to the United States, do something, and come back. But my case was different because I was like running from violence, and then it was so difficult like, to make the idea to come here and then go back. But then when I left my country and then I was called by immigration, I thought at the beginning that God didn't exist because the immigration called me. Because that wasn't the intention. So, and then I hate God for a long time until I understand that God had a good plan for me. And then once the immigration called me, that's how I got the opportunity to continue with school. That's how always my dreams to continue with my school. And then I understand why God let the immigration call me. And then it feels completely different here, being here, because comparing with Guatemala, it's a complete situation. Like here, people made you feel like even they are not your blood family, they made you feel like they are, and they support you in many ways. Like for my other names, they have helped me a lot with my traumas and everything. They have helped me, as well as the teacher here. So there's a lot of help that I have received from this country. And then with their help, I was able to successfully apply for several scholarships, which I was granted. I was also my high school salutatorian in obtaining a full scholarship at Marymount University. Also, I make the dean's list for my first semester at college. Thank you. I'm currently studying business administration. I will be, but I would like to someday work in data analysis. I also really like computer engineering, and in my spare time, I enjoy volunteering with different organizations to help to those who need help as well. Like some people help me, I think I have to give something in return, that all the help that I get. So it feels good when you give something and you know that people they get help because you're doing something. You're a change in some parts to the world. So it's really good. I feel so honored to have invited to this event at Refugees International. I realize that not everyone has the opportunity to share their voices, their history. And I feel so lucky to be among you today and be able to make an impact. My message for you is, if I can do it, you can do it. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Yaslin, for sharing that. My colleague Rachel and I I learned this morning when Yaslin got here that my colleague Rachel and I just came back from the place where she's from, in Quetzaltenango in Guatemala, which is great. I mean, it's great to see. And I mean, one of the things we noticed there was just the amazing lack of educational opportunity. That people really don't go to high school, especially there. And so what you're saying rings so true. And of course, also the violence that people are leaving. So it's a combination of factors, obviously, that drive people. And so many people have family here as well that they're coming to join. So there are a lot of kind of push factors leaving people to leave Guatemala that, again, I think are important to understanding why children are coming and why, the trauma that you experience, why these protections are important, okay? Because when we talked a little bit about mental health trauma, I mean, people are fleeing from something. They're running from something. And I think one of the things this administration wants us to do is to actually look away and not think about those push factors driving people, and in a sense, discredit the fact that people are leaving for protection reasons. They need protection, that they need international protection. That's why they're leaving. People just don't leave to leave. And what changes have been happening. So thank you so much for making that clear to us. I think I will now open it up to questions from the audience. We have, actually, there's one thing I'd like to say first. I mentioned before that there are some other protections that affect especially children who come to the United States as older teenagers. And we have in the audience here some other guests. We didn't want to have such an unwieldy panel, but we have some other guests who've come here that specifically speak to those issues. In the audience, a young man who also came from Guatemala as an unaccompanied minor and was placed eventually in Connecticut. What ended up happening was, through a mix of factors, he went to court in Connecticut to deal with a traffic incident, and because he had already turned 18, and because unfortunately courts are not considered safe spaces, and sometimes ICE arrests people who go to court to deal with certain things, he was arrested and sent to adult detention. His lawyers are here with him, and he helped him win asylum. And I think what's really heartening about the case, and why one of the reasons I wanted to invite them, and I hope they'll speak if they have anything to share with the audience during the question and answers, is that what was heartening to me about this was that unaccompanied minors are all over the country. This was in Connecticut, and the entire New Haven community, high school, the high school that Mario went to, who's here, his teachers, his lawyers, student advocates took up his case, helped make it an issue, protested about his detention, and helped him win asylum. These are things that communities across the country don't necessarily know how many unaccompanied minors are in their midst. Connecticut, for example, has had a huge increase of unaccompanied minors being resettled there. I think it went up like 300%. It used to have just a few hundred. Now there are over like 1,000 unaccompanied minors who have resettled in Connecticut. So this is an issue. So there are unaccompanied minors all over the country. In some states, it's gone up more than others. Connecticut is an example where it's gone up. A lot of unaccompanied minors are being placed in Louisiana. In like the percentage has grown tremendously. So there are places all over the country that are getting like an education in what is needed to continue to protect these young people who have resettled in their communities. So I just wanted to mention that they were here in the audience, and if their advocates have or Mario wants to speak about anything that we've discussed or other questions, they should feel free to do so. And otherwise, we're going to open it up to questions to everybody. And if you have a question, raise your hand, and we have some mics strategically placed around.
Yes, my name is Leonard Egan. As far as I know, there's only one case of coronavirus in Latin America, and that's in Brazil. But one thing that occurs to me is that the present government might, in response to the threat, the real threat, and possibly perceived not as real threat as claimed in Latin America, actually do something like close the border. Have you heard anything about this, or is it something other people are looking at, or is there any information that you have?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you're spot on, right? That there's a risk that this could be politicized, right? A public health risk could be politicized and used against refugees and asylum seekers. So it's certainly something that we're thinking about. I think, doing a lot of consideration of CDC recommendations is about not housing people in close quarters. So a lot of the work that our organizations are doing around getting kids out of detention as quickly as possible, right? Minimizing detention is going to be really important because I think that's going to be the real threat, is if we're holding people together, if anybody is sick in any sort of situation, right? Whether it's detention, school, office buildings. So certainly something that's on our radar screen.
Thanks so much for bringing us all together today. I'm Gillian Hubner. I'm a consultant with UNICEF working on the unaccompanied children's issue in the country as well. We're having actually a series of meetings in areas with the highest numbers of children either in care or released to sponsors in the community all over this country, bringing in also a conversation about international best practices and standards, which is interesting because the UN just passed a Rights of the Child resolution related to children outside of parental care, which is the strongest statement the international community has made in 20 years, 30 years of practice and policy. One of the things that I find so interesting is this, when we talk about standards of care for children and the best principles best interest determination, the fact that we have, the Family Care First Act regulating child welfare, those standards are very clear and very progressive, very child-friendly. And then we have the unaccompanied refugee minors, which has another set of standards, and then the UAC standards. So this is really, if you think about it, discriminatory, right? We're providing different systems of care, not in children's best interests, but determined by where they're born, which is fundamentally anti-American in theory. So I'm just wanted to throw that conversation into the mix, and I'm grateful for your work, and we're excited to work with you here at the national level, but also in the regions. Thank you.
Thank you. And that is true, right? We're treating children differently just because they're immigrants than our children who are from here, right? So there's different systems for different, just because you were born elsewhere. But the same protections, that's our goal, right? The same protections that you provide to the children who are from the United States should be provided to the children from other countries. So they're still children at the end of the day.
And just to add to that, I mean, thanks for bringing that up. And I think we see that in kind of the whole process for these kids, right? I think immigrant child, there's kind of more emphasis given to immigrant than given to child, right? In other contexts, kids get lawyers when they go to court. They don't get it. They're not given a lawyer when they go to immigration court. So I think, we're seeing that throughout the whole system. And I think it's really incumbent on us and with partners like UNICEF to really make sure that the focus is back on the child, right? And treating kids like kids and stop weaponizing them for political gain.
We should also sign the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Please.
Finally. We're like the big outlier, but anyway. But also, I just wanted to say about the point about different standards, about, I think what different standards depending on where you're born, but also how you enter. An asylum seeker and a refugee have to meet the same persecution standard. It's the same thing, but how you enter is the big difference, right? And I think one of what this administration has really done, they've attacked refugees and asylum seekers across the board, but I think this how you enter factor has also become really, really heightened. And so this idea that asylum seekers are all the illegal immigrants and that's it, has, I think, never before been as heightened as it is now. So there's always been people don't really know or understand the difference between asylum seekers and refugees. And it's a complicated kind of, again, same standards or different way you handle them. But I think that distinction is something that this government is really running with, and in a way that really violates international law as well. Right, the refugee convention, which we have signed. But I do think that one of the amazing things that the Young Center does is, like Olivia said, despite the lack of us not having signed the international convention and also the lack of child protections in immigration law, trying in so many creative ways to get that best interest standard in there.
Thank you. We're trying. It's taken us a while, but I think now we've been able to see even people within ICE referring cases to us and saying, this is a case where we need a child advocate. People from the courts, like judges themselves, have, recognized the need to have a child advocate and to be able to advocate for what's best for this, 18-month-old child who's walking into court in a stroller. Why is an 18-month-old appearing before a judge? without an attorney, without an advocate. And so I think they're starting to recognize the importance of having child advocates, of having a best interest standard. And it's like, just put it in the law at this point.
I just wanted to make make a comment and a shout out to one of my colleagues here, Devin Cohn. Where's Devin? Yeah. So that this issue of children not getting the rights that they're entitled to under international law, it's not just a problem in this country. So Devin just put out a report today about unaccompanied minors in Greece and the horrible lack of services they are entitled to have and do not have. And these are children coming from Syria and Afghanistan and trying to get to Europe, and Greece is the first, where they stop first in Europe. And Europe has standards, and these countries have signed some of the conventions, and yet the children are not getting the protections that they need. So this is actually a huge problem internationally, just like the asylum restrictions are a huge problem internationally that we're seeing, sort of antagonism towards people seeking refuge everywhere, especially in Western democracies. But I mean, just the problems that unaccompanied minor children face at our border is actually something similar that some patterns are similar at the borders of Europe as well. Other questions?
Hi, thanks so much for coming here and sharing your knowledge about policies regarding unaccompanied minors. I'm from a border town that's known for a detention center for minors, which has sexually assaulted several of its detainees, all of whom are under 18. So I was just wondering, you spoke about increasing resources to the border, specifically for mental health and other social-related issues. Is there any distinction that you can make in terms of resource disbursement to ICE? It has been regarded as somewhat of a rogue agency, so I was just wondering if you could speak to that and about any other recommendations you might have in terms of how resources should be allocated.
In terms of ICE? So
Yes.
okay, so I mean, the reason we talk about these resources and them being needed at the border is because oftentimes, children, they are not able to verbalize, they're not able to say what they want, what they need. And oftentimes these agencies see this sort of behavior as a way to sort of make them look like bad kids. And so I think if there were like training, training for ICE, training for CBP, training on just, some how to best practices on how to deal with children, best practices. And so I think mainly for us, it's the mental health support, right? Because prolonged stays, trauma that's not being processed, that's where we are mainly focused on. In terms of ICE, I mean, most of these agencies do what they want to do. There's very little guidance coming from the top down, so oftentimes they end up implementing things the way that they are told to by their supervisors. And so when we have these meetings with the different agencies, with CBP and with ICE, we're often asking, like, what are your practices? What are your protocols? And the answers are like, well, there's nothing. There's really nothing, and we're just doing split-second decisions on separations. So I think there needs to be more training. There needs to be more special people, like with special knowledge about how to deal with children.
And I can add, right, so the ICE, when a child is in ICE detention, ICE is responsible for detaining adults. So the kids that are in ICE facilities are in the family facilities, right, where kids are detained with their parents. So those kids are in ICE. And then kids who are without an adult to care for them go to ORR, right? So kind of the intent is very different, right? ORR is because Border Patrol can't be dropping off a 6-year-old at a bus stop at 2 a.m. and say, good luck getting to your hearing in Chicago 6 months from now, right? So ORR is, the goal of ORR was intended to be short-term care and custody just until a family member can be found, right? Now, the goal of ICE detention is different. ICE detention is more punitive, and it's saying, I'm just going to hold on to you because I don't trust that you're going to show up for court. So it's a little bit more of a punitive policy. So ICE detention really should never be used for children, right? Families should not be detained together. ICE should I think, just end the practice of detaining families and detaining kids. But I think for both, right, whenever the federal government is holding kids, right, they have to meet the Flores standards, and there has to be increased transparency and oversight over detention of children, right? We're hearing terrible stories of kids in Border Patrol facilities. Sometimes we hear bad stories of kids in ORR facilities and terrible conditions in ICE facilities. There needs to be increased transparency and oversight whenever the government's holding children.
And if I could just, so it was unclear to me whether or not you were talking about ORR or ICE. ICE, okay. So just echoing what was just said and about oversight being really important. And one of the things, there's actually a lawsuit right now going on in DC about these age out practices, so that when ORR is supposed to sort of, as Olivia mentioned, sort of make a plan for people who are still in ORR custody when they turn 18 and recommend where they should be placed next. And ICE is supposed to take those recommendations into account. And in some places, once the lawsuit was brought saying, well, ICE isn't taking that into account, in certain districts, policies changed. I think especially in Harlingen, there's better placement now, not straight to ICE. In other words, if you're in an OR detention, you would not just be transferred right when you turn 18 into ICE detention. In other districts, it doesn't seem like ICE is taking those recommendations by ORR very seriously at all and just basically transferring people to ICE. So this gets at, we need a lot more oversight. The courts can help a lot because it wasn't until, somebody raised this in litigation that it sort of pushed change in policy. So there's different ways we can do it. We can get Congress to do oversight and demand hearings and demand oversight. We can put it in appropriations bills about what oversight needs to be done. Or we can have litigators sue and say, no, you're not following the law. You're not doing what is supposed to be done. And that sometimes can help change practices as well.
Hi, I'm Manik Minhas. I used to work in refugee legal aid and protection in Greece, actually. And based on my experience there, I found that two of the biggest issues for unaccompanied minors, besides obviously the conditions in the camps, was first age determination, which was really difficult without documents or having border agents tear up documents in front of them. And also second, the issue of aging out. So I was wondering how that plays out in the US context.
Right, so I think we sort of talked a little bit about aging out, but maybe Olivia could talk a little bit about age determination. I don't know if that's an issue here.
So for age determination, usually sometimes the children come with a document and through the processing centers, they get lost. And so they don't, they can't really prove that. But within ORR staff should be trying to find the identity document. So whether it's a birth certificate. And so I know they work closely with the consulates to get those birth certificates and prove the child's age. There's some instances where they do dental exams and bone exams, and from our perspective, those are not the best way to identify a child's age, and I think it's invasive. We think it's invasive, and at the same time, not always very reliable. When they do those dental or bone exams. So usually obtaining birth certificates, or even like hospital records, anything that can prove that child's identity is helpful, and we have multiple cases where that's an issue, and so then we collaborate with partners on the ground in the different countries to help us locate those records, right? We have different people going through different, like in the RENAP in Guatemala or different places where they can actually go in person and try to get that document. In terms of the age out process, it's very like Yael briefly mentioned, with the information sharing policies, there's a lot more children falling under having no sponsors, and so there's a higher number of kids aging out of care. And when they don't have anyone, so when they have someone, they can use that person and try to get that alternative to detention placement from ICE, right? ICE should be following the NIJC's lawsuit, should be allowing them to go to this alternative to detention plan, but sometimes they don't. And so then they are transferred to adult detention, and doing the advocacy around, RR and bond on the adult detention setting is a lot harder because at that point they change from, this is a child to like, oh, this is an adult. And so we should just, not have as many protections at all. But when we are appointed and there's no relative, what we do is we find transition independent living programs in the different communities, connect them with social support services, with legal counsel, and then advocate with ICE, highlight the lawsuits, highlight all the other laws that they should be following, and to ensure that they have access to these new placements, and making sure that ICE says yes. And when ICE locally says no, we're not stopping there. We go to their supervisors, their regional supervisors, and saying like, hey, this child has trauma, has been a victim of X, Y, and Z. They have a form of legal relief. They have an asylum filed. There's a placement where they can go. They have services. You need to release them. And so thankfully, we've left our mark, and so they're like, oh, here comes the Young Center again. But we're doing what we're supposed to be doing for these children, and making sure that they age out into an appropriate setting, not into an adult jail.
And one thing I mentioned earlier, thank you, Olivia, is the special immigrant juvenile status visa. So another possible form of relief, the U visa was mentioned before, but a special immigrant juvenile status visa is really for somebody who is abused or neglected in their home country and comes to this country. And whether or not to get that visa, a state court is supposed to determine that you are neglected and abused and dependent. And so the problem is that for children 18 to 21, they're not classified that way, or certain state courts weren't able to classify them as eligible for this visa. What the government has tried to do is make that, even for states that have tried to change their laws to be up to 21, has really made it very more difficult for those 18 to 21-year-olds to qualify for those visas in sort of technical ways that I won't get bogged down in. But the important thing is there was a lawsuit against that recent settlement in California to say, no, you can't do this. You can't, for example, if somebody turned 18 and had only a temporary placement and not a permanent placement, you can't deny them access to the special immigrant juvenile status visa. And what's kind of crazy, I just was reading about this last night, is that even after the court said, no, you must allow these 18 to 21-year-olds to be eligible for these visas, ICE deported some of the plaintiffs in the case, and now the court has demanded that they be brought back, and so this is an ongoing issue. So even where you have this, and as I said, special immigrant juvenile status visas they have some more protections in the law, and there's been litigation on this, and I think the extent to which there's been an effort by this administration to really target these kids from 18 to 21 is actually quite astounding, and the need to really focus on that population. These are still, in my mind, they're still kids. I used to teach college. These are my students. These are the ages of my students. Somebody who's 19 or 20, I really think, is still a kid in many ways, and should be entitled to some protections. Certainly not all the same. They don't have all the same needs, or they have different needs than tender age children, obviously. Okay, but they still have needs, and some of them have been in the system and remain in the system remain particularly vulnerable because of other problematic policies that were put in place because they traveled here, but they arrived here when they still were under 18, right? So most of these kids applied for these special immigrant juvenile status visas before they turned 18, but there are so many processing delays and other problems that they end up turning 18 and then sort of aging out because things are so delayed. So there's, we've set the system up to protect certain people. We're failing in certain ways, and we need to make sure that just because you happen to turn 18, because we didn't protect you effectively before then, you don't age out. That's all.
Can I just add one more thing about your comment about Greece and the context in Europe? We could have a whole other panel just on the comparisons, right, of what's facing kids, I think, there that we're seeing replicated in other parts of the world. It's certainly a problem. I think we're seeing it a problem, too, of kids from certain countries, particularly African countries. There's a lot more suspicion, right, and bone density tests and dental records are not always going to be effective. And so it's certainly a problem that we're facing here and challenging it, case by case, but it requires that a kid have an advocate and attorney to do that for them, right? They can't do it on their own.
Hi, my name is Mary Sainz, I'm a professor at Georgetown. Thank you for sharing your insights into this very important and urgent situation, and gracias, Jocelyn, por venir a contarnos tu historia. I'm curious about the process of sponsorship. What are some of the factors that go into determining who makes a good sponsor? How are sponsors identified? Can private individuals agree to sponsor a migrant child? Yeah, in general, what is the process like? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the process for unification. So, one of ORR's main priorities should be unifying these children with sponsors, right? A sponsor can be a relative, a parent, aunt, uncle, brother, and sibling. It could be a distant relative. It could be a family friend. And so anyone who has had a connection to the child, and I know that they need to have some sort of relationship with that child. It can't just be a random person, who's been here in the U.S. their entire life and never met the child before. And so once they've identified, one of those categories, relative, family friend, someone who knew the child from before, there's a process, there's an application, a lengthy application. There's fingerprinting. There's child abuse and neglect checks. In some situations, for children who have disclosed, let's say, physical abuse, or there's a concern with the sponsor not being able to provide care, they do what they call home studies. So they have someone visit the home, speak with the sponsor, speak with whoever lives in the home, make sure that the home is a safe place for that child to go. And then after that home study, there's a report, and eventually the final decision is made by a representative of the government. But it is a lengthy process. Most of the applications are just in English or in Spanish. So for people who don't speak English or Spanish, having those documents translated can be difficult. But yes, no, not just any person could be a sponsor. I don't know if that answered your question.
Is it ever the case that there's no relative at all?
Yes, it's very common. Like I said, the increase in people, in children who have no one to care for them in the U.S. Is high. And so at that point, if we're appointed on the case, is identifying other potential options for these children, right? I know Yael mentioned, there's a small amount of long-term foster care placements for these children who don't have relatives in the U.S. to sponsor them out. There's this program called the Unaccompanied Refugee Minors Program, which is also a long-term foster care placement. And so for children who don't have anyone in the U.S. to care for them, and if they qualify, because the thing is, for those placements, you have to qualify. You either have some form of relief, or you were determined to be a victim of trafficking, but only if you qualify would you be eligible for those long-term foster care placements. And so one of the things that would be great is if they increase the amount of those placements, right? If there was a higher amount of foster care families who would be willing to take in these children and provide them that long-term setting that they need so that they can continue their legal case and have outside, mental health support.
I think we have time for just one more question.
I want to thank you all for coming, but I have a question. What percentage of children are you able to serve, the population of need along the border? I know the Young Center has grown a lot, but how many families or children are waiting for service?
It's hard to quantify, but the percentage is unfortunately not high. Our office is made up of about 9 individuals, and there's, in any given time, more than 4,000 children placed in the valley. And so we are limited to working with the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And so in an ideal world, every child will have a child advocate. But until then is, trying to identify, and that's probably the hardest part of our job, is identifying which cases we are going to take, right? Because there's a lot of need. But within that need, we have to be very thoughtful as to who are the children who need the child advocate the most. But the percentage is not as high as we would want it to be. there is a great need, and there's I could just do a plug right now. I mean, the Young Center has a volunteer-based model, and so we do the work that we do thanks to volunteers from the community who donate their time. So if you are in an area where there is a Young Center office and there's a training coming up, we're looking for volunteers all the time, because we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do without the volunteers who visit the children and learn their stories on a weekly basis.
Okay, sorry, we're out of time, but we'll stick around for a little while. If anybody didn't get a chance to ask a question, thank you so much for coming.